All right. Well, I'm here today with Steve Schwartz. This guy lives in Brooklyn. He's got a really cool dog named Amiko. He says his dog's crazy, year and a half old, likes to backpack. He's done solo backpacking all over the world, went to Morocco, right, recently, and just became a dad, right? You have a baby, a month old. So if we hear some crying in the background, we know what that is. It isn't, someone kidnapped in a closet or, people getting ready for the LSAT that are crying back there. It's a little baby. And yes, he is an LSAT guru. So that's why I mentioned the LSAT there. And, as a bar prep company, it might feel a little odd that we're interviewing someone who's got an LSAT prep company, but people come to our channel from all different stages of the way, and we want to have some great stuff out there to help them. And so we thought to bring Steve on, and we're very grateful for him and his graciousness and spending some time with us and coming on our YouTube channel. And we're just excited to see what kind of sage advice that he has for us. So Steve, LSAT guru, dog lover, and new father, tell us about your journey with the LSAT.
The plan was to take the LSAT, go to law school, and move on with my life. But I kind of got weirdly obsessed with the LSAT through my own preparation journey. I went to an Ivy League undergrad, and I thought I was going to go to a top 14 law school. And I got a really rude awakening when I took my first practice test and got a 152. And then that nightmare kept repeating as I kept scoring in the low 150s for months and months. And I couldn't crack this test. And it became this ego thing where I wanted to dominate it. I'd done well in other standardized tests. So I was like, well, why not the LSAT? Why can't I get this too? And over the course of what ended up being a very difficult year, I gradually raised my score up to a 175. And yeah,
that is a huge jump.
It was, and it took a long. Thanks. It took a long time.
152. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it took a long time and a lot of work doing pretty much every single LSAT ever released. At the time, there were 40 something. Now there's 80 something numbered ones, and doing a ton of old LSAT books. And so once I went through that whole journey, friends started asking me for help, and I started teaching the LSAT as well, since I taught other standardized tests like the SAT and the ACT. So it seemed a natural progression. And I really loved teaching it. And once I mastered the LSAT, then it was okay. Then it was fun. It's not fun when you can't do it, but once you know how to do something, there's a certain magic that comes with that. And so
did you take any standardized programs? Did you do any official test prep for the LSAT when you were preparing, or was this just all on your own and your own strategies?
That's a great question. I ended up actually just self-studying. I got a tutor at one point, but I didn't like him. He made me feel like an idiot. There's this one moment where he sighed when I asked how to do something that just made me feel like complete, the lowest of the low. And I was like, that's not for me. Back to the books. And it was kind of just pounding away at the books. And really, ultimately, the biggest breakthrough for me was understanding my own thought process in detailed review of what I had difficulty with, what I got wrong, what patterns what patterns in wrong answer choices I was falling for, like what traps the test makers laid for me, spotting which traps in particular I was likely to fall for to avoid making the same mistakes again. That's really where my growth came from.
Were there particular sections on the LSAT that you struggled with just more than the others? For me, I hated the games. I didn't take any prep course or read any books just on the games. And so I didn't have any of those like hacks. And so I just went into those blind, and it always took me too long and I lost all my points there. But for you, what was it like? Were you just kind of even Steven, just mediocre and just getting them all up, or were there specific areas that you really turned it around?
I would say games also. Games is probably the biggest area, I think, for a lot of pre-law folks, from humanities backgrounds. Anything that even smells the slightest bit mathematical, you want to stay away from that, right? So, and I didn't go to like any sort of nerd camp where you do those sorts of math puzzles for fun. So it didn't come naturally to me. And that was really a major focus of my studying. On the flip side, I've always been a bookworm. So the reading comprehension came more naturally, and logical reasoning was kind of in the middle.
So would you say your specialty has become helping people with that one weakness that you had before, the games and that side of the exam? And I mean, obviously, I'm guessing you can give at least semi-decent advice about non-game stuff, but is that really where you're the expert, would you say, because you turned it around so dramatically?
I think I can relate to students who have trouble with the games more than if they had trouble with the reading comp. But ultimately, the LSAT, games is only one part of it, and I teach the whole thing. You can't only cover one area because each part has somewhat of an equal weight to it. A quarter is games, a quarter is reading comp, half is logical reasoning. So we've got to get people ready for the entire thing. And games, honestly, it may be the scariest part at first, but it actually is on average the easiest part to learn. Logical reasoning and reading comprehension have more ambiguities of language that makes them in a way a bit more complex, even if they might seem more familiar on the surface.
We maybe got ahead of ourselves a little. There might be people that are watching this that just are unfamiliar with the LSAT, and we've kind of alluded to there being different sections, and you kind of rattled off a few sections and how much they're weighted. Do you want to just slow that down a little and tell us what is the LSAT? What are the pieces of it? What does it test?
Yeah, totally. So the LSAT is the law school admission test, and pretty much every law school requires it. Some are taking the GRE now, but it's not really anything to think too much about. So the LSAT is pretty much the main game in town. And it's a hard grad level exam. I think it's actually the hardest graduate admissions exam in contrast to the GRE or the GMAT or the MCAT, because it tests something that pretty much nobody has prior exposure to. So the LSAT, it's not testing math, it's not testing vocabulary, it's testing a way of thinking. You can't cram for this, you can't memorize it. It's, in a way, testing your ability to think like a lawyer, which means thinking critically, thinking skeptically, being able to extract a general principle from an argument and then apply it to a somewhat comparable situation. And so for that reason, it is tough and scary at first. And you have to it's kind of like learning a foreign language is the way I think about it. Most people don't do well on it at first, on their first attempts. They have to learn the unique language and rhythm of the LSAT. And so there are three different types of sections you may see on the LSAT. There's logic games, which are the mathematical types of puzzles that we were alluding to earlier. They don't actually have any actual math on them, but they involve a sort of symbolic logic where you have these different variables that you have to manipulate in a variety of ways. Either you're putting them in order, or you're grouping them, or you're doing both of those things at the same time. So they can get pretty scary, especially for folks with humanities backgrounds, but they are learnable. Then there's logical reasoning, which there are two sections of out of the four, so it's half the exam. And these are short, bite-sized arguments that you may have to strengthen or weaken or identify the conclusion of them or the flaw inherent within them. And these are, I think, most similar to what people experience in law school, where they're kind of like a fact pattern. Then you have reading comprehension, which at first glance might seem pretty similar to SAT or ACT reading comprehension, but it's actually quite different in what they're testing, because they're testing your ability to spot the structure of the reading passage and the intent of the author, rather than any sort of substantive knowledge.
All right. Yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you. And, obviously we have a variety of people that might stumble across this on YouTube, but it's good to cover those bases for them. What kind of mindset would you say a student needs to have to be successful on the LSAT?
Well, I think it's a bit of what I was saying earlier about thinking like a lawyer, being critical and being skeptical. But to go into a bit more depth on that, I think that the mindset is, in a way, not seeing what you expect to see, but seeing what's actually there. So many times upon reviewing a problem with a student, we just have to simply go back to the actual text and say, well, what does the question actually say? And so to illustrate this with an example, one of my favorite LSAT questions involves a doctor who is a smoker and wants to ban smoking in public places. Now, this is strange for a variety of reasons. First off, we don't expect that doctors are going to be smokers. Doctors, we think, are supposed to be healthy. They should tell people not to smoke, and you wouldn't ever see them smoking. That's our expectation. But of course, in reality, there are countless exceptions to this rule, right? Then on another level, this doctor who is a smoker wants to ban smoking in public places. Why would a smoker want to ban smoking? You would think that a smoker wants smoking to be an option everywhere. You would think they wouldn't want any bans on smoking. So someone reading this might not even see what's there. They might think, oh, this person wants to ban smoking, and they wouldn't see any potential flaws inherent within this argument or expectations of what we might have. So that's just one example. There are many, many others on the LSAT, and that's a tougher question. But even just one part of that might complexify the LSAT compared to what we see in everyday life.
So it takes a while for people to learn a new language. What are you recommending for students in terms of learning the language of an attorney to be able to perform well on the LSAT? How many months prior to the LSAT or years would you recommend? And how rigorous should they be taking practice tests? What kind of tools should they use? Do you have a basic framework for what you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the LSAT, I think, is worth devoting a lot more time than people typically do. If you think about it, law school admissions, the number one factor is the LSAT. The second factor is the GPA. Those are the two top impacts on your law school admissions chances. Now, you get your undergraduate GPA over the course of maybe 3, 4, or even 5 years. And it weighs less than your LSAT score, yet most people, of course, are not going to spend 4 to 5 years on it. But most people spend only 2 to 3 months. And the correct answer is somewhere in the middle, not 2 to 3 months, not several years. I think even 5 to 6 months could be enough to reach your fullest potential, which is actually double the time that most people spend. But in absolute terms, that's not a big difference, right? Just a few months more than the average will do much more to help you reach your fullest potential on the LSAT. And just a few points more can open up many more doors in terms of getting into a better law school or getting more scholarship money. So a few months is really just a drop in the bucket. It's worth investing the time.
Would you say that you see some diminishing returns over time though? So if you spend, 6 months, you might get up to a certain score, and then you spend another 6 months, you might only boost it another 10%, of what you had boosted previously. Do you see some of that? And is that kind of how you help people decide whether or not they're ready to take the exam when their progress is kind of tapered off?
That's a fair point. I think, of course, there are people who might take it 7, 8, or 9 times over the course of a couple of years, and I'm not recommending that. I think at a certain point, maybe 5 or 6 times is the most I would recommend taking it, and then just, of course, take your highest score, apply, and move on with your life. Or if your score wasn't high enough to get into a decent law school, then maybe you want to choose a different career path, and that's okay too. Now, I know that 5 or 6 times might seem like a lot. And I know, Adam, you went to law school, you're doing bar prep, and that probably sounds high to you also. But things have changed. Law schools no longer average multiple LSAT scores. They only take the highest, and so there is more incentive for retaking than there used to be.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, the LSAT's also being offered a lot more frequently than it used to be. It used to only be 4 times a year. Now it's going to be 9 or 10 times a year. And so retaking is easier than ever before because there's always another test date just around the corner. And again, because more and more law schools are making it clear that they do not average the scores, they only take the highest, retaking is worthwhile. Now, 6 months is probably enough time. There are people who take a year to study, and that's okay. I find that actually the people who tend to get the top scores, like 170 plus, a lot of them are studying for 6 months to a year and really brutally dedicated to it like I was. And I'm not saying you have to do that, but depends on your goals. If you want a top 5 school or if you want a full ride, maybe the 170 plus is really important to you. On the other hand, there are some great law schools you can get into with a score in the 160s.
Yeah, when you say I can't remember exactly the words you used. Did you say brutally dedicated or something? Yeah. Something that's kind of a funny way to describe it. It sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
When you say that, how many hours, are you putting in during that period of brutal dedication?
Well, I see it all. And obviously over the course of 6 months to a year, you're not going to be able to put in 20 to 30 hours a week for that long a period of time. It will inevitably lead to burnout, and we certainly don't want that. So this could be studying part-time, 10, 15, maybe 20 hours a week on the side if someone's working or they're in school. And obviously not every week. There's the holidays, there's family issues, things come up, and that's okay. You could take a week or 2 off and come back to it later. And maybe you even take it once and then you're retaking. And so that 6 month timeline is really involving 2 LSAT sittings. And then there are people who study full-time. They have family or parents or folks supporting them, and that's a great position to be in. And in that case, I would caution them even more not to burn the candle at both ends doing 30 or 40 hours a week. It's just too much.
Yeah, that's good. Sounds good. Got to keep life in balance. What are some of the most common LSAT prep mistakes that you've seen students make, and how do you correct those?
Yeah, sure. So the biggest one I already talked about a bit before, which is only putting in 2 to 3 months. It's not enough time. The LSAT is more important than that, and it deserves more time. But the next biggest common mistake I see is students doing exam after exam after exam, measuring their results, being happy or sad about what the score they got, and then moving on to the next timed exam. And you do not want to do this, because the value in doing the exams is not simply to measure your results or measure your progress or lack thereof, depending on how it turned out. The real value is in seeing which problems you got wrong and which ones you had difficulty with, and looking for those traps of encouragement towards wrong answer choices and traps of discouragement away from the right answer choices. I talked earlier about spotting my own patterns in the mistakes I was making. And that was really where my gains ultimately came from.
Can you give us an example of a type of mistake that would trip you up? You know, one of those things that would encourage you to grab on to a horrible answer or discourage you from latching on to a good answer?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And the LSAT makers are so devious about this. They just love to throw in the most complicated tricks they possibly can, but ones that they kind of lead people down a particular path so they confidently pick the wrong answer and walk away feeling good about it. So it's the worst experience to have that. And so I think one of the biggest ones I see is with logical reasoning, there are necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions, and they require very different perspectives. Now, we often love picking answer choices that contain strong language. It feels good to pick a choice that says all people XYZ versus some people XYZ. But for a necessary assumption question, you want to gravitate towards more moderate language. It's more likely to have been required by the argument than a more extreme answer choice would be. But they'll often make answer choice A the sufficient assumption, which says all, when what you really want is the more moderate choice, which maybe is choice E, that says some. But people will circle A, move on, and never even get to the other answer choices where they might have seen, if they looked at E and thought about it from the right perspective, they would have chosen the correct answer.
So are you saying, just generally speaking, that test takers should avoid absolutes? Are you saying there's turdy type questions, turton, it's like certain turd questions where they, you got to watch out for certain patterns within those questions to identify whether they are, what did you say, the necessary or
the necessary and the sufficient? Yeah. So
right.
It's all about the proper perspective from which to view the question. So there are certain question types where you want more moderate language, like inference type questions, where the question is asking, what can you infer based on the information above? Now, what you can infer is limited to whatever was already covered in the stimulus or the argument above. And so in those types, you want the moderate language. But then for a strengthening question or a weakened question, they're saying in the question stem, which one of the following, if true? And so they're saying, doesn't matter how extreme the choice is, if it gets the job done. So in those cases, strong language would be okay. So it's all about just knowing which category the question falls into.
Sure. Do you feel like there's certain parts of the LSAT that students really can't get better at, or can you improve any aspect of the LSAT with any type of student?
You can improve any aspect of the LSAT, but to varying degrees. Like I said, games is the easiest to improve on, logical reasoning somewhere in the middle, and then reading comprehension is tougher. And I'll admit it's tougher to teach that one too, especially for non-native speakers. There's, a native speaker has their whole life of English fluency and previous reading experience to bring to LSAT test day. A non-native speaker has a much harder road to go down. Not saying that you can't do it, but it is tougher. And even for native speakers, if you're not a bookworm like I was, and you haven't been reading that much for fun in the past several years, especially if you've been out of school for a while, or the only reading you ever did was for school and nothing on the side, then you don't have all those years of experience to draw upon, and it will be a bit tougher. And you typically get a less bang for your buck in reading comp prep. So I'd encourage students who are having trouble in all areas, start with the games, then reasoning, then gain some familiarity with reading comprehension. But since it is only a quarter of the test and it is toughest to improve upon, the other sections are more worth your time.
Have you identified, let me think about this. How do I want to ask this? Are there some quick tips that you have for test takers that you've seen pay really big dividends? It takes a little bit of time to understand this principle. It's easy to apply, and you're going to boost your score if you do this type of thing.
Yeah, totally. That applies to all sections. I think there's definitely some quick wins we can get in each of the sections. So for games, I think one of the biggest ones is actually drawing diagrams, not trying to do all the work in your head. And when you draw hypotheticals, reuse those for future questions. Because any hypothetical scenario where you've laid out the variables and you see that this scenario is in compliance with the rules, you can use that to solve a more general question later in the game. And so not enough students are using previous work for games diagrams they've drawn. Then for logical reasoning, I think telling the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions, a lot of folks don't know the difference. And like I said, they require very different perspectives. They both might use the word assumption or assumes in the question stem, but there are other indicator words in the question stem that tell you which one you're dealing with. And so knowing the difference is a quick win. Then for reading comprehension, I think too many people spend far too long taking notes, underlining, circling, highlighting, and it's a big waste of time. They might spend 5 minutes on that and then only have 30 seconds per question for all the ones associated with that passage. And so spending a bit less time note-taking up front and saving that time for the questions is another quick win there.
So what are the specific services or products that you offer to test takers, and what sets apart your offerings from other alternatives that are out there?
Yeah, sure. So I try to offer almost everything that someone could possibly want. So I started off offering books. I have day-by-day study plans. I have guides, cheat sheets, explanations for all sections for the vast majority of exams ever released. And so those are written materials as good supplements for those who are self-studying. I also do, of course, one-on-one coaching with students who are looking for personalized and customized LSAT prep services. I also teach courses. I have recorded courses that are on demand for each section of the LSAT, including admissions as well, and then test day mindset and focus on test day prep. I also have live online classes for those who want interaction with me live, but in a small group setting. And let's see, what else do I have? I have packages of both. So if you want written and video, I offer that too. And I suppose what makes my offerings different is that a lot of the ones from the big prep companies, you're getting an instructor who's a law school student kind of doing this on the side, just kind of passing through. And then you have folks who are kind of test prep whizzes who teach every exam under the sun. So I specialize in the LSAT. You're always getting to work with me directly. And I've been through the process. I struggled with it myself, starting from a perfectly average score, raising it up to the 99th percentile. And so I've been through the journey. I know what it's like for students who are going through the process. And aside from all the paid stuff, my focus is really on the free stuff. I'm putting out 98% of my material for free. I've got countless hours on the YouTube channel. I have a daily podcast. I have 1,000+ articles on every aspect of LSAT prep. So I try to really put out as much as I possibly can for free. And then for those who want to go even deeper with me, I've got the premium stuff too.
How long have you been doing this for now?
I've been doing this for over 10 years. I've been teaching since 2005, and I've been putting out stuff online since 2008.
That's awesome. Do you have some data in terms of past student performances and how many students you've been able to help, the test takers? How much have they boosted their scores? Do you have any kind of data like that you've gathered over the past 10 years? Yeah,
it's hard to calculate it precisely because I'm not offering a traditional in-person class where I'm with students every step of the way. A lot of times somebody buys a prep book from me, or they buy a course and they don't always keep in touch. I'm selling stuff to thousands of people, so I can't track all of it. But one thing I do have is LSAT diaries on my site, where I've actually had students write in chronicling their own study journeys, whether they use my materials or not, just kind of showing they went from the 140s to the 160s, what materials did they use, and how did they go about their studying process. And so I've got that for people, any part of the spectrum, if you're from the 140s to the 160s or the 150s to the 170s and everything in between. And there's hundreds of those. I didn't write them all myself, believe me. It's really students writing in, sharing their stories. And I've actually, another thing I've been doing recently is I've actually been recording one-on-one coaching sessions with students, so you can actually see what it's like to work with me and see them kind of gain their own insights along the way. If there were any really burning parting advice that you just feel passionate about
to folks that are taking the LSAT or are going to law school generally, what advice would you give them?
I would say that if you're struggling with it, you're not alone. This is something that everybody goes through. It really is like learning a foreign language. And if you're just taking it exam after exam, think about what you could do differently to gain some insights from the studying that you're doing. Once you engage in a deeper, more complete review process, you'll start to see the patterns in your mistakes and improve going forward.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. I know you've given us a lot of time. You've given us some fantastic advice. And I know there are people that have come across this and will come across this that will greatly benefit from the advice you've given them. And certainly if they choose to use some of the resources that you have, whether free or otherwise on your website, it's been awesome getting to know you and to chat with you. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure, Adam. Thanks for having me.